Welcome to Monograph Matters. Today we have a discussion between Rachel Leshin and Benjamin deMayo, authors of the SRCD Monograph on Stability and Change in Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation across Childhood and Adolescence. This discussion focuses on the research methodology and key findings from this monograph. Please describe the methodology used in your monograph and what you learned.
So in this monograph, we synthesized 11 years of data from this trans youth project that began in 2013, in which our research team has been investigating, right, these youth gender identities and sexual orientations, again, from all three groups that I just described. So these data have come from face-to-face visits with families, some of which were done through in-person visits to participants' homes, sometimes in a lab setting, sometimes in kind of other venues. And other visits were asynchronous, unmoderated surveys with youth and their parents. These were youth who tended to be older and more able to complete unmoderated surveys on their own. So basically, visit that with the participant, both the youth and their parents, to report on the youth's gender identity, and when the youth was old enough, also their sexual orientation identity. Importantly, since this is, a pretty kind of dynamic area of study, our methods of assessing gender and sexual orientation changed across the course of a longitudinal study to reflect contemporary understandings of these concepts and identities, and also to make sure our measures were age appropriate as children were kind of growing up within the context of the study. And so a key part of this monograph was to basically synthesize youths and parents' responses of this really diverse and heterogeneous set of measures that we asked across this long period, during which, right, our understandings changed and also, youth themselves changed. And so that was really toward the goal of deriving a quantitative estimate of gender identity and gender identity stability and change across this period.
And so once we had synthesized these longitudinal data, we were able to observe several major findings. So one major finding was that about 80% of the children who started the study as transgender boys and girls today are still living as transgender boys and girls. About 15% live as non-binary youth, so they're identifying as a gender that's not boy or girl. And about 3.8% live as cisgender youth, so they've transitioned to be living as the gender associated with their sex at birth. And what's really interesting is that we see a very similar pattern in the sibling and cisgender samples that we recruited, where around 80 to 90% of those groups continue to identify today with the gender identity that they had at the start of the study. But against the transgender kids, around 10 to 15% now identify as non-binary, so they're identifying as neither a boy nor a girl. And about 3.7 today live as binary transgender. So they've made a binary transition from identifying as a boy at the beginning of the study to now identifying as a girl, or vice versa. And our analyses in the monograph didn't show any significant differences among the groups in terms of the amount of change they've shown over time. Numerically, it is the case that youth in the siblings sample showed the most change, but we didn't find any statistically significant differences with our analytic strategy. And one of the most surprising results in the monograph is how similar the groups are just in general. Most people maintain the same identity. That's by far the most common trajectory, that gender identity is a stable trait across development. But when people do show change in all three groups, the most common change is to a non-binary identity. Relatively few children who start the study as boys are now living as girls, and relatively few who started the study as girls are now living as boys. Regarding sexual orientation, one major finding that we saw in the sample is that a large number of youth in all of the groups we studied are reporting queer identity. In other words, lesbian, gay, bisexual, or they use some other label that indicates that they're not straight. About 33% of cisgender adolescents most recently identified as queer in the study, and about 60% of transgender adolescents most recently identified as queer. So those are quite large percentages, and the most common non-straight sexual orientation that youth were reporting at their most recent visit was bisexual. So not just interest in boys or just interest in girls, but interested in both. About 44% of transgender adolescents are bisexual. About 28% of cisgender adolescents are bisexual. And among youth who are non-binary, again, they're not identifying as boys or girls, over 70% were expressing that they were interested in both boys and girls. Another part of this monograph is we also looked at whether childhood measures of gender development were at all related to youth's later gender identities or sexual orientations. So what that means is that during early visits with our research team, when the participants were still children or before they had reached puberty or were right at puberty around 12, children were asked to indicate their gender identity on a continuous spectrum, so a line saying, okay, 0 is you feel totally like a boy, 100 is you feel totally like a girl. Where do you feel like you fall on this spectrum? And they also indicated their preferences, their gender type preferences for toys and clothing, and peers. So do you prefer stereotypically masculine or feminine toys or clothing? Do you prefer to be friends with boys and girls? Those kinds of questions. And parents were also asked to complete a survey that was assessing a similar construct about how masculine or feminine their child was in terms of their toy preferences, their clothing preferences, their peer preferences, their identity, and so forth. And so we took those measures together and we looked at how they were or were not related to children's later identities. And what we found was that those measures were significantly related to later sexual orientation. So for example, a youth who identified as a boy, among a youth who identifies as a boy today, those who gave more feminine answers on those measures when they were children are statistically a little bit more likely to be gay or bisexual than boys who gave stereotypically masculine answers on those measures as children. And similarly, among youth who are girls, those who gave more masculine answers on those measures when they were kids are a little bit more likely to be lesbian or bisexual than youth who gave feminine answers. We found a similar but less robust tendency in terms of gender. So what that means is, for example, among kids who are identifying as boys in their childhood visits, so a kid who's identifying as a boy when they're young, those who had more feminine preferences were a little bit more likely to be living today as girls or non-binary people. And kids who were girls in childhood who had more masculine toy preferences, for example, were more likely to be living as boys or non-binary people today. But we do want to kind of note that those results are a little bit less consistent. But they do overall align with past findings in the literature that suggest that some aspects of early gender development relate to later gender identity and sexual orientation. However, those results for gender were small and not hugely robust.
Read more about this topic in the Monograph issue, Stability and Change in Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation Across Childhood and Adolescence. If you like this video, consider watching our Monograph Matters playlist. For additional resources related to this and other issues of the monographs of the Society for Research in Child Development, please visit monographmatters.srcd.org.